For most of this war, the story in eastern Ukraine has followed a familiar rhythm. Russia pushes, Ukraine absorbs lines. Bend, but rarely break in ways that feel sudden or decisive. Analysts talk about attrition, about slow grinding pressure, about a conflict measured not in days, but in seasons. Pocross fit perfectly into that narrative. It was never presented as a city that would fall overnight. For months, it was described as a place Russia was willing to spend time, equipment, and manpower precisely because it was difficult, a logistical hinge, a node that mattered, but one that would only shift hands. Through prolonged pressure, that expectation shaped everything: media coverage, military forecasts, even how audiences understood the map, Then quietly, that map stopped behaving the way it was supposed to. Late reports began emerging that did not sound like victory announcements or dramatic battlefield updates. They were technical, fragmented, almost cautious Russian units failing to coordinate. Ukrainian observers noting unusual movement patterns, retreats that did not line up with any announced operational plan at first. These signals were easy to dismiss. Wars generate noise, miscommunication happens, fog of war obscures reality. But this was different, because what unfolded near Pocross was not a shift in pressure, it was a breakdown in structure. By the time daylight revealed the situation, clearly something fundamental had already changed. Russian positions were not being pushed back by overwhelming force. They were collapsing. Inward units that had operated in fixed formations for months were suddenly disconnected. Command links, fractured orders contradicted each other. Reinforcements arrived too late or not at all. And here is the key point that must be understood before anything else. This did not begin with Ukraine charging forward. It began with Russia losing coherence. That distinction matters because it challenges one of the most persistent assumptions about this war, the idea that movement only happens when one side applies more force than the other can withstand. That momentum is always visible, loud, and kinetic. What happened near Pocross suggests something far more unsettling. Momentum can also disappear. For months, Russian forces concentrated heavily on this sector. Armor, artillery, manpower, all fed into a strategy designed to stretch Ukrainian defenses before winter hardened the battlefield. The logic was simple: apply pressure long enough and something eventually gives. But pressure works both ways. Sustaining it requires logistics that function, communications that hold commanders who can see the battlefield clearly enough to make decisions faster than their opponent. Remove any one of those pillars and pressure turns into strain. Remove several at once and strain turns into failure. As Ukrainian monitoring systems collected data, a pattern emerged that Russian command either missed or lines became more predictable. Unit rotations revealed exhaustion, communication traffic, exposed confusion rather than confidence. None of this made headlines. Intelligence rarely does, but when the moment arrived, Ukraine did not hesitate. And this is where the story truly begins to diverge from expectation. The collapse at Pocross was not accidental. It was not luck. It was not a single lucky strike or a surprise weapon suddenly unveiled. It was the result of patience, of restraint, of waiting until the battlefield itself became unstable enough to fail under its own weight. When Ukrainian forces moved, they did not do so loudly. They did not surge forward across the entire front. They applied pressure at exactly the points where Russian command was already struggling to maintain control. Routes were disrupted. Communication nodes were targeted. Units that depended on centralized coordination suddenly found themselves isolated. Once that isolation set in, everything unraveled quickly. Soldiers began retreating without clear orders, but because they no longer understood where the line was supposed to be. Vehicles were abandoned, not because they were destroyed, but because there was no guidance on where to move them. Entire formations dissolved into clusters of individuals trying to escape a situation they could no longer comprehend. This is what collapse looks like in modern warfare. Not a dramatic last stand, not a final explosion, but a quiet, accelerating loss of control. What makes Pocross significant is not just that Russian forces pulled back, it is that they did so in a way that revealed systemic weakness, weakness in command, weakness in coordination, weakness in the ability to adapt once a plan begins to fail. Once Russian positions near Pocross lost cohesion, the immediate question was not how much territory Ukraine had gained, but what that loss of control made possible, because in modern warfare, collapse is less about ground and more about access. Pocross sits at the intersection of multiple logistical corridors that feed Russia's eastern operations. Roads that once served as lifelines now became liabilities. Routes designed to move fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements forward suddenly had to serve a different purpose, getting units out before they were cut off entirely. That reversal reshaped the battlefield. As Russian forces pulled back in disorder, Ukraine gained something more valuable than a symbolic victory. It gained freedom of movement. Supply lines that had been under constant pressure now opened up. Ukrainian units could reposition without facing the same density of artillery fire that had dominated this sector for months. Every kilometer Russia retreated mattered. Artillery systems have limits. Rockets and howitzers that once reached deep into Ukrainian defensive zones now fell short. That created pockets of space where Ukrainian engineers could work. Fortifications could be reinforced. Units could regroup without immediate threat, right? But the most significant shift was not physical. It was temporal. Ukraine gained time. Time to observe how Russia reacted. Time to see where reinforcements were being pulled from. Time to watch new defensive lines being hastily constructed, often with fewer resources and less preparation than before. Russian commanders faced a dilemma: stabilize Pocross and risk weakening other sectors, or preserve broader front lines and accept the loss as permanent. Every choice carried consequences, and none restored initiative. This is where the collapse began to ripple outward. Units diverted to shore up. Pocross left gaps. Elsewhere, supply shortages intensified in areas suddenly deemed lower priority. Command attention narrowed, focusing on damage control. Rather than long-term planning, Ukraine did not need to push everywhere. It only needed to let Russian command overreact, and overreaction is exactly what follows surprise. As Russian forces rushed to construct new defenses, the quality of those positions reflected urgency, not confidence. Trenches dug quickly, barriers placed where terrain allowed, not where doctrine preferred. These lines could slow advance, but they could not restore momentum. Meanwhile, Ukrainian reconnaissance remained constant. Drones tracked every movement. Artillery calibrated not for saturation, but for disruption. The battlefield stayed under observation even as the pace of fighting slowed. This asymmetry matters because one side was adapting calmly while the other was reacting anxiously. Pocross became a symbol not because it fell, but because it forced Russia into a defensive posture it could not easily reverse. The narrative of steady pressure broke. The idea of inevitable advance fractured. And once that belief is shaken, it affects decisions far beyond the front. Commanders become cautious, risk tolerance drops, aggressive planning gives way to preservation. That shift is difficult to quantify, but it changes everything. What Ukraine unlocked at Pocross was not a breakthrough. It was leverage over time, over space, and over the psychological balance of the war. Wars are not fought only on battlefields. They are fought in stories, in expectations, in the version of reality each side presents to its soldiers, its citizens, and the outside world. Pocross disrupted that layer of the war as much as it disrupted the front. For months, Russian messaging relied on a simple frame: Ukraine was exhausting itself. Western support would eventually fade. Time favored Moscow advances. might be slow, but they were portrayed as steady, inevitable, and under control. Yo. The collapse near Pocross punctured that image. State-controlled media moved quickly to contain the damage. Words were chosen carefully. Retreat became repositioning. Collapse became tactical adjustment. Losses were minimized or ignored entirely. The aim was not to convince foreign audiences, but to preserve internal coherence, because narratives are a form of command. When soldiers believe their efforts fit into a larger plan, morale holds. When that belief fractures, discipline becomes harder to maintain. And the images coming out of Pocross were difficult to explain away. Abandoned vehicles, disorganized withdrawals units retreating under drone surveillance. These visuals circulated faster than official explanations could contain them. Even when coverage was suppressed, the reality leaked through informal channels. For Russian troops still deployed elsewhere, Pocross became a reference point, a reminder that even heavily reinforced sectors could unravel. That command might not always see the battlefield clearly. That retreat was possible, even when it was not acknowledged. For Ukrainian forces, the psychological impact moved in the opposite direction. Months of defensive fighting had taken a toll. Holding ground under constant pressure drains confidence even when it succeeds. Pocross reversed that dynamic, demonstrated that Ukraine could still shape the battlefield rather than merely absorb it. That shift matters deeply. Confidence changes behavior. It encourages initiative. It sharpens judgment. It reinforces trust in leadership and intelligence. At the political level, the collapse carried additional weight. Western analysts and policymakers took note, not because territory changed hands, but because the manner of the change exposed weaknesses inside the Russian military system, weaknesses that could be exploited again if approached carefully. The question shifted not whether Ukraine could survive, but whether it could still seize moments of advantage. Inside Moscow, the reaction was less visible but more telling. Leadership adjustments, quiet reassignments, sudden emphasis on defensive fortification. These are not signs of confidence. They are signs of recalibration under pressure. Pocross forced that recalibration. It challenged assumptions about control, resilience, and the ability to manage strain over time. It suggested the war had entered a phase where information, patience, and precision mattered as much as manpower. And once a war reaches that phase, it becomes far less predictable. Narratives that once stabilized begin to crack. Each side watches more closely. Each move is weighed more carefully. Risk becomes harder to justify. That is the psychological legacy of Pocross. Not a single victory or defeat, but a collision between what was believed and what actually happened. By the time the immediate fighting around Pocross stabilized, the most important effects were no longer happening on that stretch of land. They were unfolding in planning rooms. Pocross forced a recalculation, not just of positions, but of assumptions. For Russia, it exposed a vulnerability that had been carefully masked for much of the war: the difficulty of sustaining prolonged pressure without losing coherence. For Ukraine, it demonstrated that the war was still malleable, that initiative was not permanently lost, that timing could still outweigh mass. This matters because wars rarely change direction in dramatic singular moments. They shift when one side realizes the war it thought it was fighting is no longer the war in front of it. For Russia, Pocross undermined the belief that attrition alone would decide the outcome. Attrition assumes control. It assumes the ability to rotate forces, resupply reliably, and absorb disruption without cascading failure. What Pocross revealed was how fragile that control becomes under sustained observation and targeted interference. Great. Russian command now faces a battlefield where every concentration of force carries risk. Large formations are easier to detect. Predictable logistics are easier to disrupt. Centralized command structures once Dot. Advantage become liabilities when communications falter. That forces caution, and caution slows momentum. For Ukraine, the lesson cuts the other way. Pocross validated a strategy built on intelligence dominance rather than brute force. It showed that patience, when combined with precise action, could produce outsized results, that the battlefield could be shaped before a single infantry unit moved. This does not mean Ukraine suddenly holds overwhelming advantage. The war remains costly, resources remain finite, pressure persists along multiple fronts. But the psychological balance has shifted. Ukraine no longer appears solely reactive. It has demonstrated the ability to choose moments, not just respond. To them, that capability changes how allies calculate support, how planners allocate resources, and how commanders weigh risk internationally. Pocross altered conversations quietly but decisively. Support for Ukraine has always hinged on confidence. That aid translates into strategic effect, confidence that time and resources are not being consumed without result. Pocross offered evidence that strategic effect is still possible even under difficult conditions for Russia's adversaries. Perhaps most importantly, Pocross blurred the line between offense and defense. Ukraine did not launch a classic offensive, it defended actively. It shaped conditions until defense became opportunity. That hybrid hope complicates prediction. It makes future moves harder to anticipate. Uncertainty is itself a strategic weapon. This is why Pocross resonates beyond its geography. It suggests the war has entered a phase where outcomes will hinge less on dramatic advances and more on who controls tempo, information, and perception. A phase where sudden shifts are possible, but only for the side disciplined enough to wait for them. And that realization forces both sides to confront an uncomfortable truth. The war is no longer following the script, either expected. The question Pocross left behind: when historians eventually look back at this war, they will not remember every village name or every shifting line on the map. They will look for moments when the logic of the conflict changed. Moments when one side realized the war it thought it was fighting was no longer the war in front of it. Pocross may become one of those moments, not because it was the largest battle, not because it delivered a decisive victory, but because it revealed something both sides could no longer ignore. Control is fragile, momentum is conditional, and even heavily reinforced fronts can fail if the systems holding them together begin to crack. For Russia, Pocross exposed the cost of overconfidence in structure, centralized command, predictable logistics. Sustained pressure only work as long as they remain unseen, uninterrupted, and unquestioned. Once those elements are mapped, monitored, and selectively disrupted, strength can turn into rigidity. Right? For Ukraine, the collapse confirmed a different lesson. Survival alone is not the ceiling. Patience, intelligence, and restraint can still create opportunities to shape the war, even against a larger force. Initiative does not always announce itself with mass movement, but with timing. And for the rest of the world, Pocross complicates the narrative, challenges the idea that this war is frozen into inevitability. It suggests that outcomes are still being written, not just endured, that moments of instability can still emerge even after years of grinding conflict. But it also raises a harder question. If this collapse was possible here under conditions Russia believed it could manage, what does that imply about other sectors where pressure continues to build? And what happens if similar strains appear elsewhere, perhaps where they are not yet being watched as closely? Wars rarely end when one side runs out of resources. They end when one side loses confidence in its ability to control events. Pocross did not end this war, but it may have marked the moment when control itself became uncertain. If this kind of breakdown can happen once, it can happen again. And that is what makes this moment impossible to ignore. Okay. Yeah. If you found this analysis useful, take a moment to like the video so others can find it. Share it if you think this perspective adds clarity to a war often reduced to headlines. And subscribe to stay with us as we continue to track how these shifts reshape what comes.